I haven't heard from Nito, nor do I want to. So many years, so many things have happened since. Maybe he's still there, or he's dead, or he's somewhere abroad. Best not to think of him. Only that sometimes I dream of Buenos Aires in the 30s, the days of normal school, teacher's school, as it's now called, and obviously, all of a sudden, Nito and I, the night we got into the school. Afterwards, I don't remember much of the dreams, but something of Nito always remains as if floating in the air. I do what I can to forget. Best to let it fade until the next dream, even though there's nothing that I can do about it. Every so often it happens. Every so often it all comes back, like now. The idea of creeping back at night into the abnormal school, we called it that as a joke and for other more serious reasons, was Nito's, and I remember well that it was at La Perla Cafe in Plaza once, drinking Cinzano and bitter. My first reaction was to tell him that he was crazier than a chicken, in spite of which, that was how we wrote then, blasting correct spelling with a feeling of revenge that probably had something to do with the school. Nito insisted, on and on about the school at night, it would be great to get in and explore. But what the fuck are you going to explore, Nito? We know the place inside out. And yet I like the idea. I argue for the sake of arguing. I'd let him score points, but only gradually. Finally, I began to give in, with grace, because I agreed with him that we didn't really know the school in spite of having spent there 6.5 years of ball and chain, 4 to get our teacher's degree at 18, and then almost 3 more to specialise in humanities, slogging through subjects as bizarre as the nervous system, dietary laws and Spanish literature, the latter the most bizarre of all because in the second semester we hadn't finished, nor would we ever finish, a medieval collection of fables called El Conde Lucanor. Maybe because of this, because of the amount of time we seemed to waste, school seemed strange to Nito and to me. It gave us the impression of lacking something which we would have liked to know better, and yet I'm not sure. I think there was also something else. At least for me, the school was not as normal as its name suggested. I know that Nito thought as I did and had told me so at the time of our first meeting, in the faraway days of a grade 7 full of shyness, notebooks and rulers. After so many years we no longer discussed it, but that morning in La Perla I felt as if Nito's plans sprung from that old notion, and that was why it was slowly winning me over. As if before finishing the year and turning our backs on the school forever, we had still to settle an account with it, to understand at last the things that had escaped us, that discomfort Nito and I felt at times in the yards or on the stairs. I especially when every morning I came upon the iron bars of the gate, a slight knot in the stomach since the very first day, whenever I crossed the spiked gate behind which the solemn colonnade spread out, and the yellowish corridors began, and the double staircase. Speaking of gates, Nito had said, the thing to do is wait till midnight and climb over the spot where I noticed 2 of the spikes bent over. A poncho will be enough to cushion it. Real easy, I said. Then the cops appear round the corner or some old lady across the road lets out the first yelp. You go to the movies too much, Toto. When did you see anyone around at that time? How sleep the brave and all that. Slowly I let myself be tempted, certain that the whole thing was stupid and that nothing would happen, either outside or indoors. The school would be the same school as in the morning, a bit Frankenstein in the dark but nothing more. What could there be there at night, apart from benches and blackboards and maybe a cat hunting mice, of which there certainly were a few, but Nito insisted with the poncho and the torch. It must be said we were quite bored in those days when so many girls were kept under lock and key, stamp mummy and daddy, austere times necessarily. We weren't too keen on parties and soccer. During the day we read like mad, but at night we both wandered, sometimes with Fernandez Lopez who died so young, and we knew our Buenos Aires as well as Castelnuovo's essays on the city and the cafes near the port and the southern docks. So, after all, it didn't seem unreasonable for us to want to explore the school at night as well. It was like completing something left incomplete, something to be kept as a secret, and in the morning to look at the other guys scornfully. Poor fools following a schedule and doing El Conde Lucanor from 8 to 12. Nito had made up his mind. If I wouldn't come with him, he'd jump the gate alone one Saturday night. He explained that he'd chosen Saturday because if something went wrong and he stayed locked in, he'd have time to find another way out. He'd been mulling the idea in his head for years, maybe since the first day when the school was still an unknown world, and the kids in grade 7 stayed in the front yard, next to the classroom like chicks. Gradually, we'd advanced through corridors and staircases until we had a sense of the enormous yellow shoebox with its columns, its marbles, and that scent of soap mingled to the roar of the brakes and the purring of the lessons. But familiarity had not taken away entirely the notion that the school was an alien country, in spite of habits, friends, maths. Nito remembered nightmares in which strange happenings, instantaneously wiped out by a sudden awakening, took place in the school corridors, in the grade 9 classroom, on the marble staircase. Always at night, of course. Always Nito alone in the school, frozen by night. And that was one thing Nito did not manage to forget in the morning, even among hundreds of boys and of sounds. I, on the other hand, had never dreamed of the school, but all the same I would find myself thinking what it would be like under a full moon. The front yards, the high corridors. I used to imagine a mercurial clarity in the empty yards, the relentless shadow of the columns. Sometimes I'd discover Nito during a break, standing away from the others and looking up towards the balustrades of the upper floor corridors, which displayed truncated bodies, heads and torsos passing from one side to the other, and lower down, trousers and shoes that often didn't seem to belong to one same student. If I had to climb alone the great marble staircase when everyone was in class, I'd feel abandoned. I'd run up or down the steps 2 at a time, and I think that's why a few days later I'd seek permission to leave the class and retrace a certain itinerary under the appearance of someone going off for a box of chalk or to the John. It was like in the movies, the delight of an idiotic suspense, and maybe that's why I argued so badly against Nito's plan, against his idea of confronting the school. I myself would never have thought of entering it by night, but Nito had planned for the two of us, and rightly so. We deserved a second Cinzano, which we never drank because we didn't have enough cash. The preparations were simple enough. I got hold of a torch and Nito waited for me in Plaza once with a poncho bundled up under his arm. That weekend the warm weather had already started, but there weren't many people in the plaza. We turned down Urquiza hardly saying a word, and when we were close to the school, I looked back and Nito had been right. There wasn't even a stray cat to see us. Only then did I realise that the moon was up. We hadn't planned it, but I don't know if we were pleased. And yet it had its good side. We could explore the corridors without using the torch. We went once round the block to be sure, talking about the principal who lived in the house right next to the school, which allowed him to reach his office through a passageway on the top floor. The superintendents didn't live in the school, and we were certain there wasn't a night watchman. What would he have watched over in a school where there was nothing of any great value? The half-broken skeleton, the tattered maps, the secretary's cubicle with 2 or 3 typewriters that looked like pterodactyls. Nito thought that there might be something valuable in the principal's office. Once we had seen him lock it up before going off to his maths class, even with the school full of people, or maybe precisely because it was full. Neither Nito nor I, nor anyone for that matter, liked the principal, better known as Clubfoot. That he was stern and showered us with detentions and expulsions for just about anything was less a reason for our dislike than his stuffed bird's face, his habit of creeping up to class without anyone noticing him and peering in as if the sentence had already been pronounced. One or two friendly teachers, the music teacher who told us dirty jokes, the biology of the nervous system teacher, who realised how stupid it was to teach his subject in a humanities course, had told us that not only was Clubfoot a convicted and avowed bachelor, but that he also boasted an aggressive misogyny, thanks to which we had never had a woman teacher in the school. But that year the ministry must have made him realise that everything had its limits, because they sent us a Miss Maggie who taught organic chemistry to the science majors. The poor thing would always arrive in school looking vaguely scared. Nito and I imagined Clubfoot's face when he met her in the teacher's room. Poor Miss Maggie among hundreds of males teaching the formula for glycerin to the hoodlums in grade 13. "Now," Nito said. I almost put my hand on a spike, but I was able to jump clear. The first thing to do was to crouch low in case someone happened to be looking from one of the houses across the road, and crawl until we found an illustrious protector, the pediment of Van Gelderen's bust, the Dutchman who had been the school's founder. When we reached the colonnade, we were a bit shaken by the climb, and we fell into a fit of nervous laughter. Nito left the poncho stashed away at the foot of a column, and we turned right, following the corridor that led to the first turning where the stairs began. The school's smell grew more intense with the heat. It was strange to see the classrooms closed. We went and tried out one of the doors. Of course, the superintendents hadn't locked them, and for a few moments we went into the class where 6 years earlier we had started our studies. I used to sit there, and I behind you. I can't remember if there or further to the right. Look, they left a globe. Remember Gazzano who could never find Africa? It was tempting to use the chalk and leave pictures on the blackboard, but Nito felt that we had not come to play, or that playing was a way of not admitting that the silence was overwhelming. We went back to the corridor and walked to the foot of the stairs. From far away came an echo of music, reverberating faintly in the hollow of the staircase. We also heard a streetcar slamming its brakes, then nothing. It was possible to climb upstairs without using the torch. The marble seemed to receive the light of the moon directly, even though the top floor lay between them. Nito stopped halfway up to offer me a cigarette and light another. He always chose the most absurd moments to smoke. From upstairs we looked down on the lower yard, square like almost everything else in the school, including the lessons. We followed the corridor that surrounded the yard from above. We entered 2 or 3 classrooms and came to the first turning where the science lab was. This had indeed been locked up by the superintendents, as if someone might have wanted to steal the cracked test tubes and the microscope dating from the times of Galileo. From the second corridor we saw the moonlight falling directly on the corridor opposite us, where the secretary's cubicle was, as well as the teacher's room and Clubfoot's office. I was the first to hit the floor, and Nito a second later, because at the same time we both saw a light in the teacher's room. Shit, there's someone there. Nito, let's get the fuck out. Wait, maybe the supers forgot to turn it off. I don't know how much time went by, but at last we realised that this was where the music was coming from. It had seemed as far away as when we'd heard it on the stairs, but we could hear it coming from the corridor across from us, like chamber music played on muffled instruments. It seemed so unthinkable that we forgot our fear, or the fear forgot us. Suddenly, there was a reason for being there. Not just Nito's romantic spirit. We looked at each other without saying a word, and he started to crawl on all fours, glued to the balustrade until reaching the turning of the third corridor. The stench of pee from the toilets nearby had, as usual, superseded the superintendent's efforts and their liquid disinfectant. When we had crawled all the way up to the door of our class, Nito turned to me and with a gesture asked me to come close. "Shall we go see?" I agreed, because madness seemed the only reasonable thing at the time, and we crept on, betrayed further and further by the moon. I was hardly surprised when Nito, always the fatalist, stood up barely 5 meters away from the last corridor, where the half-opened doors of the secretary's cubicle and the teacher's room were letting the light through. The music had suddenly increased in volume, or maybe it was that we were closer. We heard the sound of voices, laughter, glasses clicking. The first one we saw was Raguzzi, from grade 13 science athletic champion and son of a bitch, one of those who makes their way in life thanks to their muscles and their boasting. He had his back turned to us, right by the door, but suddenly he moved away and the light fell like a whip cut through by moving shadows, a tropical rhythm and 2 couples dancing by. Gomez, whom I didn't know very well, was dancing with a chick dressed in green, and the other one might have been Kirchin, grade 12 humanities, a small kid with a pig's face and glasses, clinging to a big lady with very black hair in a long dress and pearls. It was all happening right there in front of our eyes. We could see it and hear it, but of course it couldn't be true. It couldn't be true that a hand was slowly pressing down on our shoulders, almost effortless. "You two aren't guests," said Manolo, one of the superintendents, in a slurred, drunken voice. "But since you're here, join the party and don't do anything crazy." The double push almost threw us against a dancing couple, but we were able to stop before colliding, and for the first time took in the whole group, some 8 or 10, the record player manned by little Larrañaga, the table turned into a bar, the lights low, the faces beginning to recognise us, but betraying no surprise. They all must have thought that we'd been invited, and even Larrañaga welcomed us with a gesture. As usual, Nito was the fastest. Taking 3 steps, he reached the other side, and I stuck close to him. Glued like cockroaches onto the wall, we started to actually make things out, to accept whatever was taking place. With the lights and all the people, the teacher's room seemed twice as large. There were green curtains which I had never noticed passing by in the morning, looking in to see if Minoya, the terror who taught us logic, had arrived. It all had the atmosphere of a club. Something set up for Saturday night, the glasses and the ashtrays, the record player, and the lamps that only lit the bare necessities, cutting out clearings of half-light that opened up the room. Who knows how long it took me to apply to what was happening some of that logic which Migoya taught us, but Nito, always the quickest, needed no more than a glance to identify our classmates and Professor Iriarte, and to realise that the women were boys in drag, Perone and Macias, and someone else from grade 14 science, whose name he couldn't remember. There were 2 or 3 wearing masks, one dressed as a Hawaiian girl and enjoying it, if we were to judge from the way he was shaking his hips at Iriarte. The other superintendent, Fernando, was busy at the bar. Almost everyone was holding a glass, and now we heard a tango played by Lamuto's orchestra. The couples joined once again. The remaining boys started dancing with one another, and I wasn't too surprised when Nito grabbed me by the waist and pushed me into the middle of the room. "If we just stand here, there'll be trouble," he said. "Don't step on my toes, you bastard." "I can't dance," I explained, even if in fact he was a worse dancer than I was. We were halfway through the tango, Nito keeping an eye from time to time on the half-open door. He'd been steering me towards it to run at the first opportunity, but realising that Manolo, the superintendent, was still there, we drifted back and even tried to exchange pleasantries with Kirchin and Gomez, who were dancing together. Nobody noticed that the double door communicating with Clubfoot's office was being opened, but Larrañaga suddenly stopped the record player, and we all stared. I felt Nito's arm trembling around my waist before he let go with a start. I'm slow in every way. Nito had already caught on, while I was only beginning to understand that the 2 women standing at the door and holding hands were Clubfoot and Miss Maggie. Clubfoot's drag was so exaggerated that 2 or 3 of the boys applauded timidly, but after that, there fell on us a cold soupy silence, a vacuum in time. I'd seen drag queens in the nightclubs downtown, but never anything like this. The red wig, the 5-centimetre long eyelashes, the rubber breasts trembling under a salmon-coloured blouse, the pleated skirt and the heels as high as stilts. The arms, laden with bracelets, were white and waxed. The rings dangled from the undulating fingers, now that Clubfoot had let go of Miss Maggie's hand, and, with an immensely effeminate gesture, waved her along to introduce her and let her by. Nito wondered why Miss Maggie still looked like herself in spite of the blonde wig, the hair pulled backwards, the waist drawn tight in a long white dress. The face was barely made up. Perhaps the eyebrows were a little more outlined, but it was Miss Maggie's face all the same, and not Clubfoot's fruit cocktail daubed with mascara and lipstick and the reddish bangs. Both advanced, greeting everyone with a certain and condescending iciness. Clubfoot gave us a look of surprise, which he quickly seemed to change for one of distracted acceptance, as if someone had already let him know we were there. "He didn't recognise us," I said to Nito in the lowest voice I could manage. "Like shit," Nito said. "You think he didn't notice we're dressed like bums at the party?" He was right. We'd worn old trousers because of climbing the gate. I was in shirt sleeves and Nito was wearing a thin sweater with a hole in one of the elbows. But Clubfoot was begging to be given a small glass of something not too strong. He was addressing Fernando, the other superintendent, with the manners of a fussy whore, while Miss Maggie was demanding a whiskey drier than the voice in which she was making her request. Another tango was heard and everyone started to dance, we the first out of sheer terror, and then the 2 who'd just arrived joined all the rest, Miss Maggie manoeuvring Clubfoot by the sheer play of her hips. Nito wanted to approach Kirchin to ask him what was happening. He knew Kirchin better than the others, but it was difficult right then, what with the couples crossing each other without touching, and never leaving a space empty for long. The doors leading to Clubfoot's waiting room had been left open, and as we drew near them in one of our rounds, Nito saw that the doors to the office itself were also open, and that inside there were more people talking and drinking. From a distance we recognised Fiore, a nerd from grade 13 humanities, dressed in a military outfit, and maybe that dark beauty with her hair over her face and curved hips was Moreira, a guy from grade 12 humanities, reputed to be you-know-what. Fiore came towards us before we could slip away. In uniform he seemed older, and Nito thought he saw a few white hairs in his neat coiffure. No doubt he'd added a touch of talcum powder to give himself a sharper look. "New, aren't we?" Fiore said. "Been to ophthalmology already?" We must have had the answer written all over our faces because Fiore stared at us for a minute. We felt more and more like recruits in front of a bullying lieutenant. "That way," Fiore said, pointing with his jaw towards a side door ajar. "Next meeting you show me the certificate." "Yes sir," Nito said, pushing me violently onwards. I'd have liked to argue with him about that servile "yes sir," but Moreira, now yes, we were certain it was Moreira, crowded us before we reached the door and grabbed my hand. "Come dance next door, you divine blonde, they're all such bores here." "Later," Nito answered for me. "We'll be back soon." Oh dear, everyone's abandoning me tonight. I went in first, slipping by instead of opening the door completely, I don't know why, but there were too many whys by then. Nito, following me in silence, was staring into the gloomy long corridor, and felt this was once again one of those nightmares he had about school, where whys were never answered, where all you could do was carry on, and where the only reason given was a command from Fiore, the cretin dressed up in military uniform who suddenly became part of the whole mess and started giving us orders, straightforward orders that had to be obeyed, an official order that admitted no questioning. But this was no nightmare. I was there by his side, and nightmares are not shared. "Let's split, Nito," I said to him halfway down the corridor. "There must be a way out. This can't be happening." "Yes, but wait. I'm sure they're watching us." "Nito, there's no one there." "That's why, you dickhead." "But Nito, wait a second. Stop here. I have to understand what's going on. Don't you see that?" "Look," Nito said, and it was true. The door through which we'd come was now wide open, and the outline of Fiore's uniform could be clearly made out. There was no reason to obey Fiore. All we had to do was go back and push him aside, as so many times during breaks we pushed one another as a joke or in earnest. Nor was there any reason to continue until we'd reached two closed doors, one to the side and one in front of us. No reason for Nito to go through one and realise too late that I wasn't with him, that stupidly I'd chosen the other door by mistake or out of sheer anger. It was impossible for him to turn around and get me. The purplish light in the room and the faces staring at him fixed him to the spot as he took it all in at one glance. The huge fish tank in the middle of the room rising to the ceiling, barely leaving room for those who, glued to the glass, looked into the green water. The fish slowly drifting along, everything in a deep silence that was like another external fish tank, a petrified present of men and women, who were men who were women, hard against the glass, and Nito saying, go back now, Toto, you idiot. Where did you go? Wanting to turn and escape, but from what? There was nothing happening, standing still as they were, seeing them watch the fish, recognising Mutis, recognising Piggy de Lucia, others from grade 13 humanities, asking himself why these and not others, as he'd already asked himself why guys like Raguzzi, Fiore, Moreira, why these who weren't our friends and why not Lainez, or Delic, or the other guys with whom they made projects and walked and talked. Why he and Toto among these others, even if it was their fault for entering the school at night, and that what they'd done mixed them now with all these guys whom they couldn't stand during the day, the worst shits in the school, not counting Clubfoot and Toady Ariarte, and even Miss Maggie, who'd have guessed, but there she was, the only real woman among the drag queens and the bastards. A dog barked just then, not a loud bark but enough to break the silence, and they all turned towards the invisible back of the room. Nito saw that out of the purple haze emerged Coletti, grade 12 science, arms up in the air, coming towards them as if sliding past the others, holding up high a small white dog who barked again, struggling to escape, legs tied with a red ribbon, and something like a piece of lead hanging from the ribbon, something that slowly dragged the dog down in the fish tank into which Coletti had thrown him. Nito saw the dog descend little by little, convulsively trying to free his legs and return to the surface. He saw him begin to drown with the mouth open, spewing bubbles, but before drowning the fish were already biting at it, tearing pieces of flesh, turning the water red, a cloud growing denser around the dog, still struggling, inside the bubbling mass of fishes and blood. All this I couldn't see because behind the door, which I believe closed on its own, there was nothing but darkness. I stood still without knowing what to do. I couldn't hear anything there. And Nito, where was Nito? To take a step forward in the darkness or to stay glued to the spot caused me the same terror. Suddenly smelling the scent of disinfectant, a hospital scent, an appendix operation, and barely realising that my eyes were growing accustomed to the darkness and that it wasn't a darkness. There were one or two little lights at the back, one green and then a yellow one, the outline of a cupboard and a chair, and then another outline moving vaguely towards me from a greater depth. "Over here, my boy," the voice said. "Over here, don't be afraid." I don't know how I managed to move. The air and the ground were as if made out of the same spongy carpet, the chair with chrome handles and the apparatus full of lenses and small lights. The blonde, straight wig, and the white dress of Miss Maggie shone with a vague fluorescence. A hand guided my shoulder and pushed me forward. Another hand held the back of my neck and forced me into the chair. I felt on my forehead the cold surface of glass, while Miss Maggie adjusted my head between two supports. I saw a whitish sphere with a red dot shining in the middle, almost against my eyes, and I felt the touch of Miss Maggie's knees as she sat down in the chair on the other side of the apparatus with the lenses. She started to work the handles and pedals, straightened my head once more. The light changed to green and then back to white. The red dot grew and moved from one side to the other. With whatever sight I had left, I was able to make out a sort of halo that was Miss Maggie's hair. Our faces were separated by nothing more than the lenses and the lights, and the tube through which she was scrutinising me. "Stay still and concentrate on the red dot," Miss Maggie said. "Can you see it clearly?" "Yes, but..." "Don't say anything. Don't move." "That's right. Now tell me when you stop seeing the red dot." Who knows if I saw it or didn't see it. I shut up while she kept looking from the other side. Suddenly I realised that apart from the middle point of light, I was also seeing Miss Maggie's eyes behind the lens. Her eyes were brown, and above them, the blonde wig kept bobbing up and down. A very short time went by. I could hear a sort of panting. I thought it was me making that sound. I thought all sorts of things while the lights kept changing gradually, concentrating into a red triangle with purple borders. But maybe it wasn't me after all. "Can you still see the red light?" "No, I can't see it, but I think..." "Don't move, don't talk. Look carefully now." Her breath reached me from the other side, hot perfumed gusts of air. The triangle was turning into a series of parallel lines, white and blue. My chin hurt caught inside the rubber clamp. I wanted to lift my head and free myself from that cage in which I felt a prisoner, when the soft touch on my thighs seemed to arrive from far away, the hand going up my leg and searching one by one the buttons of my fly, 2 fingers going in, unbuttoning down to the last one, looking for something that didn't want to be caught, reduced to a pitiful nothing, until the fingers grabbed hold of it and slowly drew it out of the trousers, gently holding it while the lights turned whiter and whiter, and the red dot appeared once more. I must have tried to tear myself away because I felt pain on the top of my head and on my chin. It was impossible to escape the cage set tight around me, or locked perhaps from behind. The perfume returned with the panting. The lights danced in front of my eyes. Everything came and went like Miss Maggie's hand, filling me with a languorous and infinite feeling of abandonment. "Let yourself go," came the voice from within the panting, as if the panting itself was speaking to me. "Enjoy yourself. You have to give me at least a few drops for the analysis. There now, there." I felt the touch of a bowl there where everything was pleasure and release. The hand held and moved and pressed softly. I almost didn't realise that in front of my eyes there was nothing now except a dark pane of glass, and that time was going by. Now Miss Maggie was standing behind me, loosening the straps around my head. A whiplash of yellow light hit me as I stretched myself and did up my fly. A door in the back opened and Miss Maggie was showing me the way out, staring blankly at me, a satisfied and featureless face, the wig violently lit by the yellow light. There are those who might have jumped on her there and then, holding her in their arms now that there was no reason not to hold her, or kiss her, or be rough to her, those like Fiore or Raguzzi, but maybe not. And the door would have closed on them as it did on me, with a hollow thud, leaving me in another corridor that turned in the distance and lost itself in its own curve, leaving me alone with no Nito, making me feel Nito's absence as something unbearable. I ran to the turning, and when I saw the single door I pushed against it. It was locked. I knocked and heard the knock as if it had been a shout. I leaned against the door, sliding down to my knees. Maybe I was weak. Maybe I was dizzy after the experience with Miss Maggie. From the other side of the door, I could hear loud voices and laughter. They were laughing and shouting in there. Someone had pushed Nito forward between the fish tank and the left wall along which they all were moving, looking for the exit, Coletti leading the way with his arms in the air, just as he had held the dog on his way in. The others following him, squealing and pushing, Nito being shoved in back by someone who was calling him sleepyhead and lazy bones. They had barely gone through the door when the game began. He recognised Clubfoot coming in from the other side, blindfolded and guided by the superintendent Fernando and by Raguzzi, who were keeping him from tripping over or hitting something. The others were hiding behind armchairs, inside the closet, under a bed. Kirchin had climbed onto a chair, and from there onto a bookshelf, while the others spread out in the enormous room, waiting for Clubfoot's movements, walking on tiptoe in order to avoid him or calling him in shrill voices to deceive him. Clubfoot wiggled around and let out small cries, his arms stretched out in front of him to catch someone. Nito had to escape to a wall and then hide behind a table full of books and vases, and when Clubfoot caught little Larrañaga with a squeal of triumph, the others came clapping out of their hiding places. Clubfoot took off his blindfold and put it on Larrañaga. He did this roughly, pressing against Larrañaga's eyes in spite of the boy's pleas, condemning Larrañaga to be it, blind man's buff, blindfolded with the same uncaring violence with which they'd tied up the legs of the little white dog. Once again, they all spread out among laughter and whispers, Professor Iriarte jumping around, Fiore looking for a hiding place without losing his boastful composure, Raguzzi filling his lungs and shouting 2 meters away from Larrañaga, who clutched at nothing but air, Raguzzi leaping out of his reach shouting, "Me Tarzan, you Jane! You asshole!" The bewildered Larrañaga turning round and finding nothing. Miss Maggie returning and embracing Clubfoot and making fun of Larrañaga, both squeaking with fear when Larrañaga launched at them, escaping by a hair's breadth from his stretched out hands. Nito jumping back and seeing Larrañaga clutching Kirchin by the hair, Kirchin who hadn't been paying attention and who let out a cry. Larrañaga pulling off his blindfold without letting go of his prey, the clapping and the shouting, and sudden silence because Clubfoot had lifted a hand, and Fiore by his side had stood to attention, giving an order no one understood. But it didn't matter. Fiore's uniform was in itself an order. No one moved, not even Kirchin with his eyes full of tears because Larrañaga was almost pulling his hair out, holding him without letting go. "Tusa," ordered Clubfoot. "Now Tusa and Caricatusa. Do it." Larrañaga failed to understand, but Fiore pointed to Kirchin with a quick gesture, and Larrañaga pulled Kirchin's hair even tighter, forcing him to bend lower and lower. The others were lining up, the women letting out shrill cries and holding up their skirts. Perrone first, and then Professor Iriarte, Moreira pretending to be coy, Coletti and Piggy DeLuca, a line all the way to the end of the room, Larrañaga holding on to Kirchin, letting go only when Clubfoot and Fiore ordered, "Jump but no hit!" Perrone first and then the rest of the line, jumping over Kirchin bent over like a pig, hands on his back, frog jumping but shouting, "Tusa," shouting, "Caricatusa." Every time they jumped over Kirchin, lining up again on the other side, turning round and starting again, Nito almost at the end jumping as gently as he could so as not to weigh Kirchin down, Macias letting himself fall like a sack of potatoes. Then hearing Clubfoot shout, "Jump and hit!" and the whole line jumped over Kirchin once again, but now aiming to kick him, to punch him as they jumped, breaking now away from the line and surrounded him, hitting him on the head, on the back, with open palms. Nito had lifted an arm when he saw Raguzzi giving the first kick at Kirchin's thighs, making him bend over further and scream, while Perrone and Mutis kicked his legs, and the women attacked his back as Kirchin yelled, trying to stand up and escape. But Fiore came and held him by the neck, shouting, tusa and carica tusa, hit and hit. And some of the hands were now fists against the sides, and Kurchen's head was begging for forgiveness without being able to free itself from Fiore's clutches, from the rain of kicks and blows falling on the body. When Clubfoot and Miss Maggie shouted an order both at the same time, Fiore let go of Kurchen, who fell to one side, bleeding from the mouth. The superintendent Manolo came running from the back, picked him up like a bag, and carried him off while the others clapped furiously, and Fiore approached Clubfoot and Miss Maggie as if to consult them. Nito had stepped back until he found himself at the edge of the circle, which was starting to dissolve in a desultory fashion, as if wanting to carry on with the game or start another. From there he saw Clubfoot point at Professor Iriarte and Fiore go up to him and say something. Then a barked order, and everyone lined up in fours, the women at the back and Raguzzi at the head, furiously glaring at Nito, who was taking his sweet time to find a place in the second row. I saw all this quite clearly as the superintendent Fernando was bringing me in by the arm after having found me behind the closed door which had opened to push me in. I saw how Clubfoot and Miss Maggie sat themselves down in a sofa against the wall, the others completing the picture with Fiore and Raguzzi in the front row, Nito looking pale in the second, and Professor Iriarte speaking to the assembly as if he were in class, after a ceremonious greeting to Clubfoot and Miss Maggie. I, trying to lose myself among the drag queens at the back who were giggling and whispering until the professor cleared his throat, and there was a silence that seemed to last forever. "We shall proceed with the 10 Commandments," Professor Iriarte said. "First profession of faith." I was looking at Nito as if he still were able to help me, stupidly hoping that he'd show me the way out, a door to escape, but Nito didn't even seem to be aware that I was standing behind him, staring vacantly in front of him like the rest, motionless now like the rest. Monotonously, almost syllable after syllable, the assembly proclaimed, "Strength comes from order, order comes from strength." Corollary, Iriarte demanded. "Obey in order to command, command in order to obey," the assembly recited. It was useless to expect Nito to turn round. I even think I saw his lips move as if echoing what the others were saying. I leaned against the wall, a wooden panel creaked, and one of the queens, I think it was Moreira, looked at me in alarm. "Second profession of faith," Iriarte was ordering, when I suddenly realised that it wasn't a panel but a door, and that it was slowly opening while I was letting myself fall into an almost pleasant dizziness. "Oh dear, what's come over you, baby?" Moreira managed to whisper, and the assembly was pronouncing a phrase I didn't understand. Twisting my body round, I passed onto the other side and closed the door. I felt the pressure of Moreira Macias's hands trying to open it as I slid in the bolt that was shining marvellously in the darkness. I started to run down a corridor, round a corner, 2 empty rooms in the pitch black, and at the far end another corridor that led directly to the gallery above the yard, across from the teacher's room. I remember little of all this. All I could think of was my own escape. I was only a thing running in the dark, trying not to make a sound, sliding across the tiles until I reached the marble staircase, taking it 3 steps at a time, feeling myself driven by that flight which was almost a fall, until I reached the colonnade where the poncho was, and the arms of the superintendent Manolo barring my way. I said I don't remember much of all that. Maybe I plunged my head into his stomach, or maybe I kicked him in the belly. The poncho got caught on one of the spikes of the gate, but I climbed it all the same and I jumped. There was a grey dawn coming up on the pavement and an old man walking slowly, the dirty grey dawn, and the old man staring at me with the face of a fish, the mouth open in a shout that never came. All that Sunday I didn't stir from the house. Fortunately my family knew me well and didn't ask questions I wouldn't have answered anyway. At midday I called Nito at home, but his mother told me he wasn't in. In the afternoon, I found out that he'd returned but that he'd gone out again. And when I called him at 10, one of his brothers said he didn't know where he was. I was astonished that he hadn't come to get me, and on Monday when I arrived in school, I was even more astonished to find him at the gate. He, who'd broken all records of late arrivals. He was talking to Delitzsch, but he left him and came and shook my hand. I shook it back even though it was odd to shake hands at school, but what did I care if all the rest was coming up in spurts? In the 5 minutes before the bell, we had so many things to say. But what did you do then? How did you manage to escape? The super caught me, and then... Yes, I know, Nito was saying. Don't get so excited, Toto. Let me get a word in. Yes, but... Yes, of course. Understandably. Understandably, Nito. Are you having me on? We have to go up there right now and tell all about Clubfoot. Hold on, Toto. Don't get so hot around the collar. We carried on like this, 2 monologues each on his own theme, until somehow I realised that there was something wrong here, that Nito seemed to be elsewhere. Moreira passed us and winked. From a distance we saw Piggy DeLuca running not to be late, Raguzzi in his sports jacket, all the bastards arriving and mixing in with our friends, with Lanes and with Alermi who were greeting them in return, saying, "Did you watch the soccer match? I told you River would win." And Nito looking at me and repeating, "Not here, not now, Toto. After class we'll talk in the cafe. But look, Nito, look. There's Kirchin with his head all bandaged. I can't keep quiet. Let's go up together, Nito, or I'll go alone. I swear I'm going up there alone. Right now." "No," Nito said, and there was like another voice in that one word. "You're not going up now, Toto. First you and I are going to talk." It was Nito, obviously, but suddenly it was as if I no longer knew him. He had said no just like Fiore might have said it. Fiore who was arriving now, whistling, no longer in uniform of course, and greeting us with a scornful smile I had never seen on him before. It seemed to me as if everything was summed up in these things. Nito's no, Fiore's unimaginable smile. Again I felt the fear of the escape in the night, the stairs flown down rather than descended, the super's open arms in the colonnade. And why wouldn't I go up? I said absurdly. Why wouldn't I tell about Clubfoot, about Iriarte, about all of them? Because it's dangerous, Nito said. Here we can't talk about it, but I'll explain in the cafe. I stayed on after you left, you know. But in the end, you too escaped, I said, hoping, reaching out to him as if he weren't right there, standing in front of me. No, I had no need to escape, Toto. That's why I'm telling you now to keep quiet. And why should I do what you say? I shouted, almost on the point of crying, wanting to hit him, to take him in my arms. Because it's to your advantage, said Nito's other voice. Because you're not such an idiot as not to realise that if you open your mouth, you'll pay for it. You can't understand now, and we've got to go into class, but I tell you again, if you breathe a single word, you're going to regret it for the rest of your life if you have a life left. He was joking, of course. He couldn't be saying what he was saying, but there was the voice, the manner, the assurance, and the tight-lipped mouth. Like Raguzzi, like Fiore, the same assurance and the same mouth. I'll never know what the teachers taught us that day. All day long, I felt Nito's eyes glued to my back. And nor was Nito following the classes. What did he care about classes now? Those smoke screens set up by Clubfoot and Miss Maggie for that other thing. The really important thing. That which would fulfill itself step by step. Just like step by step the 10 Commandments had been recited for him to learn, one after the other. All that which would one day be born from the obedience to those commandments, from the future following of the commandments. All that which Nito had learned and promised and sworn that night, and which someday would come to pass for the greater glory of the fatherland when the time was ripe, and when Clubfoot and Miss Maggie would give the order that it all begin.